Today, I'm going to show you exactly how I paint this scene here. We're going to talk about values and watercolor timing and everything that you need to know to take that next step forward in your painting. As I typically do, I lay in my drawing and then I wet down the back and the front of the paper. And I lay this on the surface that I'm painting on. What I'm doing here first is laying in the color for the sky. Up at the top of the sky, I want a deeper, richer mixture, so I'm using more Cobalt Blue, and near the horizon, I'm using more Cerulean and more water. The sky will be stronger at the top and it will fade a little bit as it nears the horizon. I used a little bit of raw sienna and lavender to create that warmth at the horizon here. And now I'm laying in the warm color for the rocks. And to help this area be focused, I want to have more warmth and saturation in this part of the painting. I'm using raw sienna with a little bit of lavender as I get away from that area to dull down the warmth of that raw sienna. Now I want to lay in some of the blue for the water, and I'm carefully doing this because I don't want the blue to run down into the rocks here. I have this large brush and I'm just kind of taking my time in that area, carefully touching that edge, and I'm not overloading my brush, so I don't want that to just flow down and take over that part of the painting. For the water mixture, it's mainly Cobalt Blue with a little bit of Cerulean and a touch of neutral tint. I'm working my way down the scene. I'm adding more warmth on the rocks here, and that mixture is raw sienna with just a little bit of lavender. I felt like the water needed some more strength, so I added some more Cobalt Blue to get up to that value that I wanted it to be. And it's important to realize that when we are painting on wet paper, it's obviously going to dry, and when it dries, it's going to fade a little bit. So I knew that that water seemed a bit light, and I wanted to strengthen it up in this first phase of the painting. Now I'm getting a little bit of blue washing onto those rocks there. That's okay. I'll take care of that problem in a little bit. What I want to do now is let the warm color of the sand merge with the color of the water and create a nice soft transition right in this area. Now, a little bit of blue drifted into these rocks. And so I'm going to take this brush, I'm pushing down and lifting off some of that. And that does a few things. It lightens the value there, and it takes away some of that Cobalt Blue out of the stone color. I'm adding a little more saturation into this area of the painting, using a little bit more raw sienna, painting that while it's still wet. And I had this bit of water that peeks through here, and I went ahead and painted that. I'm using the smaller brush so I can have more control to paint those little areas. And now I need to think about the face of the rocks here, and then this grassy hill that's in the foreground. So I'm using more raw sienna, more lavender, and then down when I get into where the grass is, I'm adding in some Cobalt Turquoise and a little bit of raw sienna. All right, this is the tricky part with watercolor timing. The paper is still damp. I'm gonna go in now and I want to paint those distant hills and keep them nice and soft. And one way to do that is to do it while the paper is still damp. So I'm going in with this synthetic brush. I'm not using a mop brush because that would flow down the paper and destroy what I've already painted. But I've loaded up this synthetic brush and I can take away a little bit of the moisture with a paper towel and just leave a nice subtle mark for the hill that has a nice soft edge to it. And I think that the key to creating depth within this scene and within most scenes is really allowing the background to be very soft, to minimize the information, minimize the texture that we see in the background of the scene. And the best way to do that is to paint a lot of that wet into wet. And that's what I'm doing here. So I'm painting in that distant hill, carefully working on the paper while it's still damp. And again, I feel like the water needs to be a little bit stronger. So I'm loading up that same brush with some Cobalt Blue, a little more neutral tint. And you can see that as I drop that in, I'm still getting nice soft edges. And before I get down to where those rocks are, where the light is really shining on the rocks, I'm gonna take a paper towel, I'm gonna push down and lift off some of those areas where I wanna preserve the light. A paper towel is an underrated tool when painting. You can dry your brush off with it, you can lift off things on your scene, and lately I've started to use it to get a little bit more texture into certain areas of my painting. So after I've done that, I'm going to continue to work my way down, and I want to strengthen up the water a little bit. Mostly why I wanted to do this now was to get this right here. That soft edge that just fades, that will help me get a real feeling of distance. Once I get all the other information, all the texture into the painting, that soft edge becomes very important to show the horizon line and really allow it to feel like it's in the distance. All right, now that I am done with the water, I want to go back down and work in the foreground a little bit more. I'm really gonna need to build up that strength. And while the paper is still wet, I'm gonna drop in some Cobalt Turquoise and some neutral tint and just increase the value there, add more strength into the scene. And I also want to spend some more time working on these rocks within the first wash. So I'm using a little bit of raw sienna, a little bit of burnt sienna, some neutral tint, and adding in some warmth and a little more value on some of the rocks. And now that I'm done with that, I'm gonna address the hills in the background just a little bit more. I felt like I needed to flatten out some of those lines where the land was meeting the water. And I still want it to be soft, so I need to do it while everything is still wet. So it's a subtle little change, but here it kind of like curves up a little bit, and here it's more flat. And I felt like I needed that to flatten that line out. Now the tops of the hills I'm going to darken just a little bit. The paper is damp, and you'll notice I'm using an even smaller brush now. This is a smaller synthetic brush. It's a Perla Escoda brush, size 12, and I'm loading it up and dropping some of this in while it's still wet, giving some of the hill a little more value and interest at the top, and letting the bottom just remain more loose and soft. And once again, I'm fiddling with the line on where the land meets the water. And there is a look at the first wash of the scene. We laid in all the light values, slowly working my way down the scene. And that's why I like working in this way, by wetting down both sides of the paper. I worked on this for 30 minutes. I was painting, it was keeping the paper wet. I was able to go back and continue to work into it. And that is where we are with the first wash of the scene. At this point, I let everything dry and then I get into the middle values. Okay, things are dry and we're ready to move ahead. I'm gonna zoom ahead and show you where we end up. So this is how it looks after I get the middle values in place. Let me back that up. I start over here on the left side of the painting. I'm right-handed, so it's beneficial to start on the left so my hand isn't getting on top of what it is I'm trying to paint. I'm working over here, thinking about the trees and the foliage here first. I'm using a smaller soft brush and kind of using the side of it to get these broken marks. And I like the texture that I can create when I use the side of the brush and thicker paint. That's the key. If I come in here with too much water, I'm just not gonna get that texture. It just won't happen. So paint consistency is a really important thing to pay attention to. Ask yourself, throughout the process, how much water is on my brush? How much paint is on my brush? And what is the consistency like? And if you aren't sure, take some scrap paper, make a few marks. Am I getting the nice thick broken mark that I want? Or do I need to change my paint consistency? So I added a few darks into the shadows of the trees. Also, I'm using my palette knife here to scratch in a few little branches. And now I'm gonna work from here, from this wet edge, it's a small connection, but it's still a connection, into the darker areas of the water. So I needed to have another wash to really bring out the light on the stone. If you look back here just a little bit, that doesn't work, right? There's not enough value difference between this and this. The way to really make the light feel evident is to paint darker on the water to let the light become more apparent on the stone. So I'm painting the darker bits of the water. And then when I get down to the middle ground, foreground, that's when I can do more broken marks and create more texture. And that is a good way to help create depth within the painting, is more texture closer up, less texture further away. This mixture for the water, again, is more of what I used in the first wash, more Cobalt Blue and Cerulean with a little bit of neutral tint to make it even richer. So I've worked my way down to here. Now I can get into the stone, or the rocks here on the coast. And I'm using some raw sienna, some burnt sienna, a little bit of neutral tint, a little bit of raw umber, all those good earth tones, mixing them together. And I want to leave some texture. I want to create some texture on the rock here. I'm using this Escoda size 12 Perla brush, using the sides of the brush. Now I'm going to work with the foreground. That's largely the middle values for this area. I want to get into the foreground, really paint a bold, strong wash to keep this in shadow and to let the viewer's attention get into the middle of the painting. That's always the challenge here with the foreground, is how much information do I include? If I'm looking directly at the foreground and painting it as I see it, I'm going to end up painting every blade of grass, every flower, every plant that's here. What I'm trying to do is squint at it and see how it relates to the rest of the scene. I'm looking at my reference photo, I'm squinting, I'm seeing how that area relates to the rest of my scene and trying to paint it in that way. If that's always the trick I think in painting, is how representative do you want each part to be versus how all the parts relate to each other. So it's that push and pull that we're always kind of dealing with as we work through the painting. But I really wanted this to be dark. I'm using my finger, smudging some of it, scratching in a little bit of detail, trying to really create an impression of that bit of the scene. What I decided to do was to have a few of the flowers kind of popping up, creating some interest so we know what this is, right? I don't want it to just be a straight line that goes across a dark kind of triangle in the bottom of the painting. I want to have a few flowers that stick up so we know what it is that we're looking at. So we need some interest, but we don't want too much interest that will take away from the rest of the painting. All right, this is where we are at after the middle values are in place. Up next, I'm going to show you how I paint the darks and the details, and we're going to finish up this painting. This is where we're going to end up. Let me walk you through the steps and how I got there. So a lot of the heavy lifting is done. Now we're looking to refine the scene, to add the finishing touches, the bits of detail, to organize the scene a little bit more, to focus it. And one of the ways I was able to do this was by including the figure that you can actually see in the reference photo. There's a tiny little figure standing on the cliff, so I've added that figure in here. It gives us a nice focal point. I'm adding some more texture on the rocks, and one reason this was important was to create some separation between this rock and this rock here. So I'm adding some more texture and adding some of the shadows that helps the light become more apparent, more evident in the scene. Doing the same thing here, connecting the shadow shape into the shadow up here on the rock that's closer to us, and then creating this nice cast shadow. I liked this shadow that comes over to here, and again, it stops right here. That helps me define the face of this rock as well. Adding in a few little sweeping lines where the waves are rolling in here. I really liked this part of the painting. And I wanted to paint over this area one more time and create a little more texture in the water. I felt like it wasn't quite complete. And by adding some more of these ripples and more information here, it again helps all of this feel closer to us and surprisingly lets that background feel even more further back. And a little more attention to this rock here, over here on the left, adding a few more details. These little lines here, not only do they help the face of the stone look more believable, but these are verticals. And what verticals do is they lead the eye around the scene. So if my eye catches down here, I see these lines and I come up to here and then I come over to here where the figure is. So use verticals in your painting to help guide the viewer's eye around the scene and keep them in the scene. And I was fiddling with this rock a little bit more, trying to not do too much. When you are adding these finishing touches, paint a little bit, step back and look at your whole scene. Paint a little bit more, step back and look at everything. So many times we get just consumed with what's happening in these small little different parts of the scene that we forget to take in the whole painting. I'm using some gouache, and this is Holbein Ivory White Gouache, and I'm using a little bit on the tip of my brush and adding in just little places where the water is splashing or we need little highlights. That's what this is really good for. getting in a few of those little highlights around the scene, putting some little marks on the top of the rocks and things like that. And finally, one thing we always see on the coast here are seagulls, and I decided to add a few little seagulls into the scene. So I'm taking some gouache, I put a few little dots on there, and now I'm gonna just add in some of the wings and kind of fiddle with that a little bit. And here is a look at the final painting. I hope it was helpful for you to see me painting through this and explaining my process along the way. And if you're in need of a resource, something to help you if you feel stuck, if you're not sure where to go, if you're feeling overwhelmed in your watercolor journey, take a look at this free resource I have for you. Have you ever been really excited about a painting and you get all set up, you find that right reference that you're excited about, and then it's time to go and you feel lost? I have a free resource that I want to give to you today that can help with these problems. My 5 steps to plan a successful watercolor painting. I walk you through the crucial planning phase of your painting that will help you understand what you're going to paint first, second, and third. The planning is really so important, especially in watercolor. This medium is harder to correct. It's so immediate. So having that plan is very important. I send you a PDF that you can download. And the great thing about this is you can have it on your phone. You could print it out. You can download this right now before you start your next painting. All you have to do is follow this link here and download my 5-step guide to planning a successful watercolor painting.